They called the cops on me demanding I'd be evicted from the lake cabin I built with my own hands. The HOA screamed I was trespassing on community property, claiming they owned the land and even the dock. But the officer barely got through their lies before I handed him the original DID signed decades ago, proving I own the entire shoreline, including the HOA's prized boat dock. The officer turned to the HOA and said 5 words that shut everything down. He owns your only access. That's when their faces dropped. Because without me, their boats stay dry, forever. It started like any other quiet weekend at the Lake Cabana retreat I'd built nearly 15 years ago on the same stretch of land my grandfather once camped on as a boy, a place steeped in family history and personal memories. I was sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, watching the early morning mist roll off the lake. When I heard tires crunching down the gravel drive, I knew that sound didn't belong. The road to my cabin was private, gated, and nestled deep within a forested patch that led straight to the water. When I stood up and stepped off the porch to investigate, I was met with the jarring sight of an HOA golf cart with 2 board members, Linda and Kirk, flanked by a stern-faced man in uniform. They had brought a county deputy with them. I hadn't even received a phone call. "You're trespassing on HOA property," Linda snapped, before I could say a word, her sunglasses reflecting the glint of the sun and a look of smug righteousness plastered across her face. "We've filed a complaint. This cabin is on community land, and you need to vacate immediately." I blinked. "Excuse me," I said, slowly stepping closer, trying to remain calm. "This is my land. My deed goes back to 1967, predating your HOA by decades." But Linda was already waving a folder in the air. "Our updated plat maps show this land as common use for our lakefront HOA. This whole stretch is shared property, including this cabin and the shoreline behind it. You've been occupying it illegally." The deputy looked unsure. "Sir, do you have your property documents?" I nodded. "Inside, want to come in and see them," Linda scoffed. "You're not going anywhere until he leaves," as she barked toward the deputy. "He's been warned before he even threatened our board members last month." That part was a lie. What really happened was that I'd refused to let the HOA install security cameras facing my dock from my trees. And when they started nailing signs onto my fence, I warned them that I'd press charges for trespassing. Now it looked like they were trying to flip the script on me. I led the deputy inside the cabin and pulled out my thick file folder. It had the original deed, a surveyor's map from 1967, and a newer 2022 county certified update. All clearly showed that I owned the lakefront parcel, the dock, and a 100-foot buffer zone around the shoreline. The very buffer that the HOA's walking path and boat dock were now sitting on without permission. The deputy reviewed the documents in silence for several minutes, then he looked up and said, "This appears to be valid. Did you submit this to the county recently?" I nodded again. "Yep, registered last year when I did the last property improvement. I also have aerial photos showing the HOA's dock extension crossing into my property line." The deputy walked outside, requested both Linda and Kirk to step away from the cabin, and quietly made a phone call, likely to the sheriff's office or a county land office. I could hear Linda's voice rising as she kept trying to shout over him. "He's lying. That land belongs to our association. The previous owners let us use it." She wasn't entirely wrong about that. The previous owners of this land were distant cousins of mine who didn't care much for conflict. They let the HOA put in a communal dock, walking trail, and even a bench that faced the lake, under a gentleman's agreement that nothing permanent would be done. But I bought the property fair and square, and I had never agreed to anything. The moment I took ownership, I told the HOA to cease all use of the dock and shoreline area, and I even installed new signs marking the boundary. They ignored all of it. The deputy returned, and his face said it all. "I just spoke to the county recorder's office," he said, voice firm now. "This land belongs to Mr. Waller. He's the legal owner of not just the cabin, but this entire stretch of shoreline. The HOA's dock is sitting on his property." Linda looked like she'd been slapped. "That can't be our maps." The deputy held up a hand. "Your maps aren't legal title. What he has is." "I suggest you stop interfering with his private property." But she didn't back down. "We'll take this to court. We have lawyers. We'll get an injunction." I smiled at that. "Good. I'd love to bring up your trespass, your unauthorized construction, and the fact that your entire community relies on that dock you built on my land for boat access. Without it, your residents won't be able to launch anything." That's when it hit them. The realization came slowly, especially for Kirk, who went pale as a ghost. Most of the HOA's lakefront homes didn't have personal docks. They'd all pooled funds to build that one. Central dock complete with lights, kayak storage, and a floating platform, all of which now sat on my land. Legally, I could have it removed. Better yet, I could lease it back to them. At my price? I didn't say that part yet. Let them stew first. The deputy nodded toward me. "Sir, you're within your rights. You don't need to vacate anything." Then he turned to Linda and Kirk. "Unless you want to risk a criminal complaint, I suggest you and your HOA board stop stepping foot on this property." They left in a huff, barely able to contain their rage. But I knew this wasn't over. That night, I walked the shoreline as the sun set, watching the last rays of light shimmer across the water. The dock stood quiet now. No HOA families fishing, no kids jumping off into the lake, no late-night parties blaring Bluetooth speakers, just stillness and the satisfaction of knowing the land was mine. I pulled out my phone and emailed my attorney. We had work to do, because if the HOA thought today was bad, they had no idea what was coming in Chapter 2. By the time Monday morning rolled around, the emails from the HOA started flooding in like a broken dam. Legal threats, cease and desist letters, and a bold claim that the HOA was seeking emergency legal action to prevent unlawful obstruction of community property access. I smirked while reading them from the comfort of my lakeside porch, sipping a hot mug of coffee with my dog curled up at my feet and the sun rising over water that no one from the HOA dared to touch anymore. What the HOA didn't know was that I had already anticipated their legal tantrum and had spent the weekend preparing. My lawyer, Miss Garland, one of the sharpest land use attorneys in the state, had already drafted a formal cease and desist letter that not only included my deed and legal survey but detailed photos, GPS-mapped coordinates, and evidence of the HOA's years-long unauthorized use of my land and dock. What made it even better was the clause she found in the county records, a conservation easement designation that granted me full control over all shoreline structures due to environmental protection laws the HOA had never bothered to study. That meant their dock wasn't just illegally placed, it was also built in direct violation of protected habitat ordinances. That little detail turned my personal property dispute into a potential environmental violation on their part. So, while they were gearing up to sue me for kicking them off land they never owned, I was preparing to bury them with regulatory firepower. That afternoon, I made the first move. I sent certified letters to the HOA board, the HOA's attorney, and the Municipal Lake Management Office informing them of my intent to reclaim and restrict access to the dock and shoreline. I gave them 72 hours to remove all structures they'd installed on my property, including the communal kayak rack, the wooden benches, the security camera pole, and the floating dock extensions. I made it clear, if they didn't comply, I would not only file for damages but pursue fines through the Environmental Land Commission, which could reach up to $10,000 per violation. Predictably, the HOA didn't take it seriously. On day 2, they installed a new sign on the dock that read, HOA use only trespassers will be prosecuted. It was a bold move, considering that very dock stood entirely on my land. But that sign was the final nail in their coffin. I filed trespassing charges with the Sheriff's Department and reported the dock and structure violations to the county's Environmental Enforcement Division. 2 days later, a white government truck pulled up, and 2 environmental officers began taking photos, measuring distances, and asking questions. I gave them the full story complete with documents, time-stamped photos, and aerial drone footage showing the dock stretching well into the protected shoreline zone. The next day, the HOA received an official citation from the county. They had 21 days to dismantle the dock or face daily fines. The rage was palpable. Kirk, the HOA treasurer, showed up on my driveway, red-faced and trembling, shouting that I was destroying a community treasure and that I'd be ostracized forever. I didn't respond. I just pointed to the freshly installed private property. No trespassing violators will be prosecuted. Sign that now lined the trail where their members used to stroll every morning. The best part? That sign was reinforced with motion-detecting cameras, all legally protected, all fully documented. The HOA was unraveling. Homeowners started panicking when they realized they couldn't access the lake anymore. Most of their homes didn't have direct shoreline. The communal dock was their only point of entry. Kayak clubs were canceled, summer parties postponed, and boaters had nowhere to launch. Parents complained. Angry posts began appearing on the neighborhood Facebook group, blaming the HOA board for ruining the community's access to the lake. But Linda, ever the narcissist, doubled down, calling me a bully, claiming I forged the documents, and insisting the HOA would eventually take control of the land. She made the mistake of repeating those lies at the next HOA board meeting, which was recorded and leaked. That was my opening. I had my attorney file a defamation suit against Linda personally. We served her papers the next day in front of the clubhouse during a summer fun event. Her face went ghost white as the server handed her the envelope while her grandkids watched her frozen in place. The board tried to hold an emergency vote to allocate HOA funds for her legal defense, but several homeowners objected, saying they wouldn't pay a dime for Linda's personal mess. The infighting began. The Facebook group exploded. A dozen homeowners demanded an audit of HOA spending, especially after discovering the HOA had spent over $38,000 on dock improvements over the years for a structure they didn't even legally own. I watched it all unfold from my cabin deck, feet propped up, while grilling some fresh trout and flipping through a thick binder of lease contracts. Because here's the twist. I wasn't just going to kick the HOA off my land. I was going to charge them to use what they took for free. My attorney drafted a shoreline lease agreement offering the HOA the right to continue using the dock, but at a price. $6,000 per month, paid quarterly, with a 5-year binding term. If they didn't accept within 30 days, I'd begin the removal process and file a claim for back usage fees totaling over $200,000. When the HOA board received the lease offer, they lost their minds, but their panic only grew when they consulted their own attorney, who confirmed it was a generous offer given the legal circumstances. Facing environmental fines, a defamation lawsuit, and a revolt from their own community, the board called an emergency all-member vote. The result? Over 70% of homeowners voted to accept my lease offer just to avoid total loss of lake access. The final cherry on top. The HOA had to formally acknowledge, in writing, that the land and dock belonged solely to me, and that all prior usage was without consent. That acknowledgement was stapled to the new lease and recorded with the county clerk's office, forever enshrined in public record. Today, I receive quarterly payments from the HOA, totaling $72,000 a year, for access to land and water I already own. Their precious community dock now carries my family name on a bronze plaque bolted to the front, Waller Shoreline. Private owner, and Linda, she lost her position on the board and settled out of court after her lawyers realized the video recordings proved she made knowingly false claims. She paid damages and signed a public apology, which I proudly laminated and nailed to a tree, just 20 feet from where she once yelled at me to leave community property. Now, every morning when I walk that trail with my dog and pass the peaceful lake, I smile, because the HOA tried to erase my ownership. They tried to take what wasn't theirs, call the cops on me, and destroy the legacy of land my grandfather loved. But in the end, they paid literally to stay afloat, and I never left.